November 14, 1979. The United States Treasury Department, Washington. Officials working through the night watched their computer screens as they executed the largest financial freeze in American history. With a single executive order, President Jimmy Carter froze roughly $12 billion in Iranian assets scattered across American banks and institutions. Diplomats in Tehran had been held hostage for 10 days. The United States believed it had finally found a weapon that would force the new revolutionary government to its knees. Economic pressure, they were certain, would break Iran within weeks. The clerics in Tehran would have no choice but to release the hostages and negotiate on American terms. 45 years later, Iran remains under some of the most comprehensive sanctions ever imposed on any nation. The United States has spent decades refining these measures, tightening restrictions, adding new penalties, bringing in international partners, and using increasingly complex financial tools to cut off the Iranian economy from global markets. Yet the Islamic Republic endures. The government that American officials expected to collapse has not only survived, but expanded its regional influence, developed advanced missile capabilities, built nuclear infrastructure, and maintained support networks across the Middle East. Every American administration since 1979 has assumed that enough economic pain would eventually force Tehran to abandon its core policies. Every administration has been wrong. What did Western policymakers fundamentally misunderstand about Iran, and why did 4 decades of escalating pressure produce the opposite of what Washington intended? To understand why sanctions failed to break Iran, you need to recognize that the Islamic Republic was forged specifically to resist outside pressure. The 1979 revolution did not happen because Iranians wanted better economic conditions. It happened because millions of people rejected what they saw as foreign domination of their country. The Shah had been installed through a CIA-backed coup in 1953 after the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized Iranian oil. For the next 26 years, the Shah ruled with American support, building close ties with Washington and Israel while crushing domestic opposition through his brutal secret police, Savak. Iranian students, workers, religious leaders, and intellectuals across the political spectrum came to see the Shah as an American puppet who served Western interests rather than Iranian sovereignty. When Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returned from exile in February 1979, he arrived to lead a revolution that defined itself against foreign interference. The revolutionary slogan was not about prosperity or development. It was neither East nor West, only the Islamic Republic. This was not talk meant to appeal to outside powers. It was a declaration that Iran would chart its own course regardless of economic consequences. The revolutionaries who seized power had spent years fighting a regime backed by the world's most powerful nation. They had endured torture, exile, and watched thousands of their comrades die. The idea that economic hardship would make them surrender what they had fought for completely misread the nature of the movement. The hostage crisis revealed this fundamental disconnect almost immediately. When Iranian students stormed the American embassy on November 4, 1979, taking 52 diplomats hostage, they were not making a calculated economic decision. They were expressing rage at decades of American interference in their country. President Carter responded with exactly the tools Washington believed would work. He froze Iranian assets, banned Iranian oil imports, imposed a comprehensive trade embargo, and secured international condemnation. American officials confidently predicted the revolutionaries would release the hostages within weeks once they felt the economic pain. Instead, the hostages remained captive for 444 days. The sanctions did not force concessions. They reinforced the revolutionary narrative that America was the enemy trying to destroy Iran's independence. The Iran-Iraq War that began in September 1980 became the defining event that permanently shaped how the Islamic Republic would respond to pressure. Saddam Hussein invaded Iran believing the revolutionary chaos had left the country defensively weak. He expected a quick victory that would allow Iraq to seize disputed territory and crush the revolutionary government before it could export its ideology to Iraq's Shia population. Instead, the war lasted 8 brutal years and killed somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people on both sides. For Iran, the war became known as the Sacred Defense, a struggle for national survival against an aggressor supported by the United States, the Soviet Union, European powers, and neighboring Arab states. During this war, Iran faced not just military attack but comprehensive international isolation. The United States provided intelligence to Iraq, shared satellite imagery of Iranian positions, and helped coordinate Iraqi military operations. When Iraq used chemical weapons against Iranian troops and Kurdish civilians, killing tens of thousands, the international community remained largely silent. European nations sold weapons to Iraq. Arab Gulf states financed Saddam's war machine. The Soviet Union supplied advanced military equipment. Iran stood almost completely alone, cut off from conventional weapons markets and international financial systems. Yet the Islamic Republic did not collapse. Instead, the war consolidated the revolution. The experience of fighting for 8 years while isolated, transformed how Iranian leaders viewed pressure from outside powers. The war proved that the regime could survive extreme hardship if it framed the struggle as defending Iranian sovereignty and Islamic principles. Revolutionary institutions like the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the Basij militia were built during this period. These organizations were not just military units, they were ideological instruments designed to mobilize the population through religious devotion and nationalist resistance. Young men volunteered for human wave attacks against Iraqi positions, motivated by promises of martyrdom and the defense of the homeland. The state learned it could sustain public support, even under devastating conditions, if it successfully framed external pressure as foreign aggression, rather than the natural consequence of Iranian policies. Now, this might seem like a minor detail in the broader story of sanctions and pressure, but understanding how these war years shaped Iran's institutions is crucial to understanding why every sanctions campaign that followed would fail. The Islamic Republic didn't just survive the war, it built an entire system designed specifically to outlast economic isolation. By the time the war ended in 1988, the Islamic Republic had developed institutional structures specifically designed to withstand external pressure. The Revolutionary Guard became an economic power that controlled vast portions of Iran's economy beyond government oversight. Charitable foundations called bunyads managed billions of dollars in assets seized from the Shah's supporters, creating parallel economic networks that operated independently of international markets. These institutions gave the regime tools to distribute resources, reward loyalists, and maintain essential services even when conventional economic channels were blocked. Western policymakers designing sanctions decades later failed to understand that they were targeting an economy deliberately structured to resist exactly the kind of pressure they planned to apply. The nuclear program that emerged in the early 2000s followed the same pattern. When the International Atomic Energy Agency revealed in 2002 that Iran had built undisclosed nuclear facilities at Natanz and Iraq, Western powers responded with escalating sanctions designed to force Iran to abandon uranium enrichment. The logic seemed straightforward. Iran's economy depended heavily on oil exports and integration with global financial systems. Cut off those connections and Tehran would have no choice but to negotiate. Instead, Iran responded by expanding its nuclear program and developing increasingly complex sanctions evasion networks. The sanctions imposed between 2010 and 2015 represented the most comprehensive economic warfare campaign in modern history. The United States convinced the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and other major economies to join in restricting Iranian oil exports. International banks were forced to choose between doing business with Iran or maintaining access to American financial systems. The SWIFT banking network, which processes international financial transactions, expelled Iranian banks in 2012. Iranian currency lost 2/3 of its value. Inflation hit 40%. Oil exports, which had exceeded 2.5 million barrels per day in 2011, fell to barely 1 million by 2013. The Iranian economy contracted severely, yet Iran did not abandon enrichment. What happened instead demonstrated the fundamental flaw in the sanctions strategy. Iran built elaborate evasion networks that eventually became more complex than the sanctions themselves. These networks operated through multiple layers. Front companies in Dubai, Hong Kong, and Malaysia purchased goods that were technically sanctioned but labeled them as civilian products. Ships turned off their tracking systems and engaged in ship-to-ship transfers in international waters to disguise the origin and destination of Iranian oil. Exchange houses in the United Arab Emirates converted sanctioned Iranian rials into dollars and euros through complicated chains of currency swaps. Chinese refineries, particularly smaller independent refiners, bought heavily discounted Iranian crude and processed it without reporting the transactions to international authorities. The Revolutionary Guard, which American sanctions specifically targeted as a terrorist organization, became the primary operator of these evasion networks. Guard-linked companies managed the shadow fleet of tankers that transported Iranian oil without insurance or legitimate registration. Guard operatives ran the currency exchange networks that moved money across borders without using the formal banking system. Far from weakening the Revolutionary Guard, sanctions actually increased its economic power by making it the only institution capable of accessing resources the government needed. The very organization that Western policymakers most wanted to undermine became stronger because sanctions created opportunities that only an entity willing to operate outside legal channels could take advantage of. International cooperation, which was supposed to make sanctions more effective, proved impossible to sustain. China never fully enforced restrictions on Iranian oil imports because Beijing valued energy security and regional influence more than Washington's preferences. Russia saw Iran as a useful partner for countering American dominance and provided military technology despite sanctions. Turkey maintained trade relationships with Iran partly for economic reasons and partly because Ankara wanted to preserve regional influence. Even European companies found ways to continue business with Iran through subsidiaries in countries that did not enforce reinforce American sanctions. The assumption that the entire world would join in cutting off Iran indefinitely collapsed when countries calculated that their own interests were better served by maintaining relationships with Tehran. The 2015 nuclear agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, briefly changed this dynamic. Iran agreed to strict limits on its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. For approximately 3 years, the deal provided Iran access to some frozen assets and allowed increased oil exports. But the agreement never delivered the economic transformation Iranian leaders had expected. European banks remained cautious about doing business with Iran because American secondary sanctions still threatened anyone who engaged with sanctioned Iranian entities. Major international companies hesitated to make long-term investments in Iran. The economic benefits of the agreement remained limited, which created a serious problem when the political situation changed. When President Donald Trump withdrew from the agreement in May 2018 and launched what his administration called maximum pressure, Iran faced the most severe sanctions in its history. The Trump administration aimed to drive Iranian oil exports to zero, completely cut off Iran from international financial systems, and forced Iran to negotiate a deal that would address not just nuclear activities, but also missile programs and regional activities. American officials believed that unprecedented economic pain would finally break Iranian resistance. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo issued 12 demands that included ending all uranium enrichment, halting ballistic missile development, withdrawing forces from Syria, ending support for Hezbollah and other regional groups, and fundamentally changing Iran's foreign policy orientation. The maximum pressure campaign achieved significant economic damage. Iranian oil exports fell below 300,000 barrels per day by late 2019. The value of the rial collapsed to record lows. Inflation accelerated. Access to foreign currency became severely restricted. The government struggled to fund basic services. Yet Iran did not give in. Instead, Tehran responded by systematically violating the nuclear limits it had accepted in 2015. Iran increased uranium enrichment levels, installed advanced centrifuges, restricted international inspections, and shortened the time it would need to produce weapons-grade material if it chose to do so. The Revolutionary Guard attacked oil tankers in the Persian Gulf, seized foreign vessels, and shot down an American surveillance drone. Iran's proxies in Iraq launched rockets at American military bases. Iranian-backed Houthi forces in Yemen struck Saudi oil facilities with drones and cruise missiles. This pattern revealed the core problem with the maximum pressure strategy. By offering no diplomatic pathway to sanctions relief, the Trump administration gave Iran no incentive to show restraint. Iranian leaders calculated that since they were already facing maximum economic pain with no prospect of relief, they had nothing to lose by increasing pressure on American allies and interests. The strategy assumed that economic suffering would eventually force Iranian leaders to choose between their economy and their foreign policy. What actually happened was that Iranian leaders chose to impose costs on their adversaries rather than surrender. The assassination of Revolutionary Guard commander Qasem Soleimani in January 2020 demonstrated how pressure campaigns can spiral beyond what policymakers intend. Soleimani had directed Iranian proxy operations across the Middle East for over 2 decades and was arguably the second most powerful figure in Iran after the supreme leader. His killing was meant to deter Iranian aggression. Instead, Iran responded with ballistic missile attacks on American bases in Iraq and accelerated its nuclear activities further. The maximum pressure campaign had created a cycle where each side imposed costs on the other without any mechanism for backing down. Throughout this period, the assumption underlying American policy was that the Iranian government would eventually prioritize economic welfare over ideological commitments. This assumption fundamentally misread how the Islamic Republic functions. The regime's legitimacy does not primarily rest on delivering economic prosperity. It rests on maintaining independence from foreign domination and defending what it defines as Islamic and Iranian interests. For the clerical leadership and the Revolutionary Guard, surrendering to American demands would undermine the entire basis of the revolution. They would rather endure economic hardship and maintain their regional influence than accept restrictions imposed by Washington. Popular protests that erupted inside Iran periodically over economic conditions seemed to support the sanctions strategy. In 2017, 2019, and 2022, large demonstrations against inflation, unemployment, and government corruption swept across Iranian cities. Western officials pointed to these protests as evidence that pressure was working and that the regime was becoming vulnerable. But the protests never developed developed into movements capable of challenging the government's hold on power. The security forces, particularly the Revolutionary Guard and Basij, remained loyal and violently suppressed dissent. The fragmentation of Iranian society, where different groups had competing visions for the country's future, prevented the formation of a unified opposition that could overthrow the regime. The structure of power in Iran makes it particularly resistant to pressure. The supreme leader, currently Ali Khamenei, holds ultimate authority over all major policy decisions. He controls the Revolutionary Guard, the judiciary, state media, and the security services. Elections for president and parliament provide limited space for factional competition, but the unelected Guardian Council screens all candidates and blocks anyone who questions the system's fundamental principles. This means that even when reformist politicians win elections, they cannot fundamentally change Iran's foreign policy or strategic orientation. The deep state, controlled by the supreme leader, maintains continuity regardless of who wins elections. The economic structure also creates groups with real interests in resisting pressure. The Revolutionary Guard and affiliated companies profit from sanctions evasion. Smuggling networks thrive when official trade is restricted. Black market currency exchanges make fortunes from manipulating exchange rates. Government-connected businesses benefit from reduced foreign competition. While ordinary Iranians suffer from inflation and reduced living standards, the politically connected elite find ways to profit from sanctions. This creates a twisted incentive structure, where those with the most power to change policy are precisely the people who benefit from keeping the current system in place. China's relationship with Iran further undermined the effectiveness of pressure. As American sanctions tightened, China became Iran's economic lifeline. Chinese companies bought Iranian oil at heavily discounted prices, invested in Iranian infrastructure projects, and supplied manufactured goods to the Iranian market. The 2021 strategic partnership between Iran and China made official what had become a practical alliance. Beijing saw Iran as an important partner in its Belt and Road Initiative and as a useful tool for countering American influence in the Middle East. As long as China was willing to maintain economic ties with Iran, the idea of complete economic isolation remained impossible. Russia's support added another dimension that sanctions could not address. Moscow provided Iran with advanced military technology, including SIFS-300 air defense systems and fighter aircraft. Russian and Iranian forces worked together in Syria to keep Bashar al-Assad in power. When Russia faced its own comprehensive Western sanctions after invading Ukraine in 2022, Moscow and Tehran deepened their partnership. Iran supplied drones that Russia used in Ukraine. Russia provided military technology and diplomatic support for Iran. The two countries worked together to develop alternative payment systems that went around Western financial infrastructure. Sanctions had accidentally pushed together two adversaries of the United States, creating a partnership that made both countries more resistant to pressure. The psychological dimension of resistance also mattered more than Western policymakers understood. Iranian leaders and much of the population saw sanctions not as neutral policy tools, but as acts of aggression comparable to warfare. The idea that America was trying to starve Iranians into submission became a powerful message. State media constantly reinforced the narrative that Iran was standing up to foreign bullying and that hardship was the price of independence. This framing turned sanctions into a test of national will rather than an economic calculation. For a population with deep historical memories of foreign interference, from the British and Russian occupation in World War I to the American coup in 1953, resistance to outside pressure carried symbolic meaning that went beyond material costs. By 2021, when the Biden administration attempted to revive nuclear negotiations, Iran's position had fundamentally changed from 2015. The Iranians who negotiated the original nuclear deal had believed that sanctions relief would bring transformative economic benefits. That belief had been shattered. Hardline factions that had always opposed the agreement gained power by arguing that America could never be trusted to honor commitments. When negotiations resumed, Iran demanded guarantees that any future American president could not simply withdraw again, something the American political system cannot provide. The cycle of pressure and resistance had created permanent mistrust that made diplomatic solutions far more difficult. The broader lesson from 4 decades of failed pressure is that economic sanctions work best against countries that share basic assumptions with the sanctioning power about the costs and benefits of different policies. Sanctions can influence countries that calculate costs rationally and are willing to trade concessions for economic relief. They do not work against revolutionary regimes that define themselves through resistance to outside pressure and that have built institutions specifically specifically designed to survive isolation. Iran is not a normal state making normal calculations. It is a revolutionary system that views compromise with the United States as giving up everything. This does not mean sanctions had no impact. They clearly damaged Iran's economy, reduced government revenue, limited access to advanced technology, and constrained Iran's ability to fund regional activities. But damage is not the same as effectiveness. The question is not whether sanctions hurt Iran, they obviously did. The question is whether that pain produced the policy changes Washington wanted. On every major issue, from nuclear enrichment to regional influence to missile development, the answer is no. Iran today has a more advanced nuclear program than it did when sanctions began. Iranian forces and proxies operate across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Iran has developed missiles with ranges exceeding 2,000 kilometers. The Revolutionary Guard remains more powerful than ever. What sanctions actually achieved was to make Iran more self-reliant, more isolated, more authoritarian, and more hostile to the West. They strengthened exactly the elements of the Iranian system that Western powers wanted to weaken. They created opportunities for corruption and smuggling that enriched the Revolutionary Guard and organized crime networks. They hurt ordinary Iranians while leaving the political elite largely protected from the pain. They turned a country that had once maintained significant economic and cultural ties with the West into a partner of America's primary adversaries. The fundamental error was assuming that Iran would behave like a rational economic actor when it had explicitly defined itself as a revolutionary movement. The Islamic Republic was designed from the beginning to resist pressure. Its constitution commits it to exporting the revolution and confronting global powers. Its security services are organized to maintain control regardless of economic conditions. Its elite has accepted that permanent hostility with the West is the price of maintaining independence and regional influence. No amount of economic pressure could change these core characteristics without fundamentally destroying the regime, and American policymakers consistently avoided the level of intervention that removing the government would require. The alternative to failed pressure campaigns was never surrender to Iranian demands. It was recognizing that changing Iranian behavior required engagement that addressed Iranian security concerns, while imposing meaningful costs for specific actions. The 2015 nuclear agreement briefly demonstrated this approach. It did not end Iranian missile development or regional activities, but it did freeze the nuclear program for several years. The agreement fell apart, not because pressure was insufficient, but because political support in the United States was too fragile to withstand domestic opposition, and because Iran never received the economic benefits it had expected. What emerges from this history is a bleak lesson. Some adversaries cannot be forced through economic pain alone. When a regime's legitimacy rests on resisting foreign pressure, when its institutions are designed for survival under isolation, and when it has powerful partners willing to help it evade sanctions, pressure campaigns produce stalemate rather than surrender. Iran has endured 45 years of escalating sanctions not because its leaders are irrational but because they have calculated, correctly, that they can survive economic pain more easily than they can survive the political consequences of surrendering to American demands. The sanctions regime built against Iran has become one of the most complex and comprehensive in history. It spans financial restrictions, export controls, technology denial, oil embargoes, shipping constraints, and diplomatic isolation. Thousands of Iranian individuals and entities are designated on sanctions lists. International lawyers spend entire careers navigating the regulations. Yet this enormous apparatus has not achieved its stated goals. It has damaged Iran's economy without changing Iran's strategic behavior. It has hurt the Iranian population without weakening the Iranian government. It has demonstrated that pressure alone, no matter how intense or prolonged, cannot force a revolutionary system to abandon the principles that justify its existence. The legacy of this failure extends beyond Iran. It has implications for how the United States approaches other adversaries who might prove similarly resistant to economic pressure. North Korea has survived decades of sanctions without abandoning nuclear weapons. Venezuela endures comprehensive American pressure without collapsing. Cuba maintained its communist system through over 60 years of embargo. The common thread is that revolutionary or dictatorial regimes with nationalist legitimacy and willingness to impose costs on their populations can outlast pressure campaigns that would force democratic governments to change course. For Iran specifically, the future likely holds continued hostility rather than peace. The revolutionary generation that seized power in 1979 is aging, but the institutions they created will outlast them. The Revolutionary Guard, which now controls vast portions of the economy and dominates the security system, has no incentive to support major policy changes. The network of proxies and partners Iran has built across the region provides strategic depth that makes the Islamic Republic a permanent player in Middle Eastern politics. China and Russia will continue to provide enough economic and military support to prevent Iran's complete isolation. From November 1979, when Jimmy Carter Carter froze Iranian assets, to the present day, American policy has rested on the assumption that enough pressure would eventually break Iran's will. That assumption has been tested across 8 presidencies, through dozens of rounds of escalating sanctions, and during multiple crises that brought the United States and Iran to the brink of war. Yet Iran endures, not because it is strong in conventional terms, but because it built a system specifically designed to prioritize resistance over prosperity. The clerics who ruled Iran learned during the revolution and the subsequent war that they could survive enormous hardship if they maintained ideological commitment and mobilized nationalist sentiment. Every sanctions campaign since then has reinforced rather than challenged that lesson. The question was never whether pressure could damage Iran, it was whether damage would produce compliance. 45 years of evidence provides the answer. Pressure worked perfectly at imposing economic costs. It failed completely at changing behavior. The Islamic Republic survived because its leaders always cared more about maintaining power and independence than about economic growth. They built institutions capable of operating under extreme constraints. They developed narratives that turned hardship into proof of virtue. And they correctly calculated that the United States would never commit to the full-scale intervention that removing them from power would require. Every assumption underlying decades of sanctions policy proved wrong because those assumptions were based on how normal countries behave, and revolutionary Iran was designed specifically to reject normal calculations. The sanctions achieved exactly what Iran's founders intended. They proved that the Islamic Republic could stand alone against the world's most powerful nations and refuse to bend.